when I started to look back at the history books, even the history books in Canada had the strange thing. When I went to go look for important events, they wouldn't include the date. Or I'd have to check 4 different sources and find in a footnote on page 800 that there would be the date, and how difficult it would be. The biggest research insight I've had in the last year is taking all these facts I gather from all these different and simply putting them in chronological order. And it makes it perfect. It doesn't take anything more than common sense that any roofer has, that you can see quite clearly what's happening. My biggest insight is that there's no truth without context. That any fact or any date or anything, you put it over here and it means nothing. You put it in its context, it could mean everything. And that's the main trick of the media, of concision, of now, it's over. I gotta go. Next one. You can't think.
It normalizes. Yeah, it makes everything equally important and doesn't, like you said, help us understand that context. In fact, Alex and I were having a conversation yesterday about, something Jordan Peterson spoke about. You know how when people talk about temperature sensors on the Earth, well, there used to not be concrete there, and therefore we can ignore it because now there's concrete. Well, but no, the context of that is the concrete is part of the warming. That's a whole part of our addition to that. And so that's an example, I think, of what you're describing of this, the lack of context in what he's saying, so that people can ground that in, yeah, that's absolutely true. And also that's part of the cumulative impact problem that we have, and the temperature rising based on those activities.
We need those sensors in urban areas, especially because we need to know how much this heat bubble created by all this asphalt and all this concrete is affecting the stratosphere, and how storms behave and where they move, because like if you create a microclimate like this heat bubble over top of a city, then you'll see, and I've seen it because I've lived in Calgary my whole life. We used to get wicked storms in the Northwest, and now they all just like split around the city, and they go to the urban or the rural areas around the city. So the storms actually just split because of this unnatural environment that the cities have actually created.
As soon as these boots hit the floor, I'm giving back to Mother Earth, all of my relatives in 7 generations. That's how much I give back. I don't give an hour here or an hour there. Because to me, they can take the money, the glory, they want to be looked at as the expert, not themselves. To me, the only thing that really matters is that I'm protecting all my relatives. And I'm looking at 7 generations. Not of human beings, guys. Get that out of your heads. I'm not talking about your kids, your grandkids, and your great-grandkids. I'm talking about all of creation. Until you can get that in your head and in your heart and in your spirit, there's no hope.
The period of agricultural colonization that I was talking about a little bit is really tightly coupled with processes of Indigenous peoples' dispossession. The creation of reserves, the signing of the numbered treaties across the Prairie West, the imposition of a number of genocidal policies on Indigenous peoples in the Prairie West were part of a process of what scholar James Daschuk has called clearing the plains. Meaning moving Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities out of the way, as it was perceived by those involved in executing this policy, of the agricultural society that was going to develop to benefit largely Western Europeans or Americans or people who had been in Canada for generations already by this point, Eastern Europeans later on. And we need to recognize that these are processes that went together. In the context of the developing agricultural society in the Prairie West from the late 19th through the early 20th century, we see history of disregard of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous interests is one that persists into the 20th century and, of course, up into the present day. Indian Affairs is a bureaucracy that's been in place since the 19th century. It remains in place. And in many ways, it reflects some of the fundamental problems in the relationship between Indigenous peoples, certainly in the Prairie West, across what's now Canada more broadly, and the Canadian state. The Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration was created in 1935 in the context of this 1930s emergency that I was describing a few minutes ago. The Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration was created by the federal government as part of what was called the Canadian New Deal. Listeners might be more familiar with the American New Deal, a suite of policies put in place to the south of us to try to deal with a crisis in the United States at that time. There was a whole suite of policies, parallel in some ways, different in others, in Canada that were called the Canadian New Deal as sort of a reference to that set of policies in the South. The Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, the PFRA, was one of these policies that was brought in at that moment. The Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration remained in operation as a bureaucratic entity within the federal government, sometimes in the Department of Agriculture, sometimes in other federal government departments. It remained in operation through to 2009. So, over these 70 plus years of operation, this is an organization that did a whole bunch of different things in the Prairie West and also more broadly. And it was ultimately eliminated in 2009 by Stephen Harper's Conservative federal government as a part of what some people have called Stephen Harper's so-called war on science.
What I am very focused on is what the UN says, that there's just not a lot of time left to change course a bit. And that's why I'm so focused on an actual movement. The number of people who will be impacted by irreversible climate change is huge. And so we need to also keep our eye on the prize, which is getting our leaders to publicly have to address that this is actually happening. There's some denial that really tipping points could happen and the time is now. So I just think we should be bold and brave and willing to look foolish even, and just somehow make a movement happen, because we don't have a lot of time. There's a new movie coming out, Outgrow the System. And I'm excited to potentially do a screening of that, because even that 3-minute video is just so hopeful. Like, it's very optimistic. And I feel like we could get people excited and wanting to come out to our rallies if it's a fun time.
We have to normalize supporting local, whether it's Alex made me a walking stick, if this thing is great and I want more of them, or friends of ours are having a barbecue this weekend and everybody has to bring something for the food bank, and we're filling a truck full of food for the food bank. So yes, things need to change, but it's hard. In the Peace region, the small family farm doesn't exist. They're gone. All the farms up there are these massive, massive corporations. How do we bring back the small family farm? My parents, near the end of their farming life, were organic farmers, not because of how they believed in it or the good of it. It was, there was more profit in being an organic farmer. Is that how we bring back the small family farms? We need to support local. You need to spread it on your Facebook and your Instagram, or however you get information out there, because that's the only way people are going to change.
I am very concerned about poverty and equity and those pillars of democracy that I see potentially going to be bulldozed for privatization. So through these things, I want to get back involved and regenerate my understanding of agriculture through the lens of regenerative agriculture. And so whether that's talking to my family about practices that we could consider for the farm, those dialogues are really hard. And my dad just talking through his belief system and the barriers that I see between the political camps and the tribalism that's occurring here in Canada, and the skills that I'm learning in deep canvassing with Alberta Talks are so valuable with anybody that I speak with, whether it's my kids or my dad or my cousins that are actively farming. Understanding and collaborating, personally, as well as is in my community, and hopefully co-creating change.
I feel like in all of this chaos and destruction and grief, there is this sense of like people coming together for what's right. right? For what's humane and decent and good. And in an environment like that, there's no room for any sort of hatred or discrimination against anyone. Because the second we start to do that, we play that game, we're reinforcing the systems that are oppressing us. The same system that looks at me as a Muslim woman or, an Arab is the same system that looks at people for being Jewish and stereotypes and is bigoted. This is not an anti-Semitic to speak about rights and justice, and it's really unjust to suggest otherwise.
What reconciliation looks like in regards to Palestine and all world conflicts, really, honestly, it's removing permanent member status at the UN Security Council, removing the veto power from US and China and Russia. Okay, remove it. There should be no veto. Okay, if it's democracy, it's democracy. If we remove the fact that the imperial powers in this global system, rules-based system, okay, remove that veto power, remove that and make it into a multipolar system.
Unless there is self-determination and the ability for them to determine their future, it's always been that they are on the side suffering while world leaders discuss their situation about, are we going to recognize a state? Are we going to consider these settlements illegal? Are we going to? They need to be at the forefront, leading the conversation on what their future looks like.
They're a young generation that's tasted struggle now and seen the reality. They're watching on TikTok and on social media images of children and civilians being picked out of the rubble while their governments justify it, right? So these people are not going to accept the old way anymore, nor should they, and it's going to mean that all of us are going to have to start looking at the world and living in a different way. We talked a bit about refugees and a bit about the exploitation of the rest of the world. This is not academic, abstract stuff. I mean, the world we're living in is built. It is the world that came out of colonialism. It is the world that came out of the exploitation of the rest of the world and continues to be maintained through that exploitation. A lot of people go into this refugee debate as if all of these issues are going to be explained by, we need to get the refugees out of here. That'll solve the housing crisis. That'll solve the economy. That kind of stuff is actually going to have to change. This is a part of this entire situation, and the structures of oppression exist for indigenous people in this country. They exist for people of color in this country. They exist for working class people in this country and all around the rest of the world too. And all around the rest of the world, it exists like that. Yeah. And these structures are toppling down and people are starting to see it. And that shouldn't be of concern to people, frankly. The world that we've known is coming to an end. And if you're one of the hundreds of millions of people who has lived for years in poverty or in homelessness or in hunger, or one of the millions of Palestinians that has been living under occupation for 75 years, good riddance. Enough with this world. Let's have something else.
If you want to have a discussion about Zionism with me, a Jewish person who would love to have that conversation, okay, please reach out to IJV Calgary and even give you a safe place to talk about your feelings. It's IJV Calgary on Instagram. If you want to start having that conversation, if you're curious about what it means, to talk about, even the idea of Zionism, and maybe start to think about what the implications are for the world around you, please reach out to me.
It's a critical time for us all to ask ourselves, this is our corner of the world. What can we do to make it better? Like we are past this being a critical point in time. Global warming, it is upon us, climate change, the environment, the toxins, everything. It is all coming and rushing to ahead. We need to ask ourselves, how can we take an action? And don't for a second belittle what you can do as an individual. And this is what I love to see. Like if there's a point of optimism here, it's exactly that, is that every person who stands up and says, I'm going to boycott this, or I'm going to join this encampment or go to this protest. That is how you build movements. It's by people, individuals coming together and risking things. The consequences are real, but I really think that being silent those consequences are much worse.